Good evening and good morning, depending on where you are located right now. On behalf of the International Law Society and the Facultad Libre de Derecho de Monterrey, we welcome all of you to the event Violence Without Borders, the Intercontinental Dimension of Gender Violence. We are honored to have this evening with us, or morning, Professor Dr. V.S. Elizabeth, who is Vice Chancellor of the Tamil Nadu National Law University, and also Dr. Lidia Casas Becerra from the Diego Portales University of Chile. First, I'm going to talk to all of you a little bit about each of the opponents we're going to have tonight. First, Lidia Casas. She holds a BA in Urban and Regional Planning from the University of Saskatchewan, Canada. She holds a law degree from the Universidad Diego Portales and an LLM, Master of Laws, from the University of Toronto, and a JD from the University of Ottawa, Canada. She was a Ford Reproductive Health Fellow, received the IDRC, International Development Research Center, and a grant for the Global Health Research Initiative. She also received the International Planned Parenthood Federation Western Hemisphere Region Award for outstanding family planning advocacy and the 2017 Women's Day distinction from Comunidad Mujer for outstanding career in promotion and defense of women's human rights. She was a member of the advisory group, Gender and Rights Advisory Group of the Department of Reproductive Health of the World Health Organization, and she has also been a consultant for the Justice Center of the Americas, GSCA and GTC, a German cooperation agency. Lidia is also a member of the Latin American Network of Professors of Law, Gender and Discriminated Sexualities, Red Alas, and her areas of research are the functioning of the justice system and gender violence, sexual and reproductive rights, and discrimination. She has participated in the judicial defense of emergency contraception in Chile since 2001. She teaches classes on law and gender in Chile and Latin America, conducts training workshops for judicial system operators and research, and has numerous publications. Now, V.S. Elizabeth. She holds an MA, a PhD in history, an LLB, and registered for an interdisciplinary LLD at the National Law School of Indian University. She has been professor at the National Law School of Indian University, a member of the High-Level Committee on Status of Women in the Government of India. She has also been a member of the governing board in the International Association of Law Schools in Washington, D.C., and in the executive committee of the Indian Association of Women's Studies. She has a live membership in the Indian History Congress and in the Indian Association of Women's Studies. She's a member of the planning board of National Law University in Nagpur, member of the Academic Council at the NLSIU, member of the Consortium of Law Universities, and in the Academic Council of Gujarat National Law University, and president of the Equitable Tourism Options in Bangalore since 2019. Among her interests and areas of interests, there are topics such as women and law, violence against women with specific focus on domestic violence and sexual harassment of women from the perspective of human rights and feminist jurisprudence, and also in history of the early medieval period, particularly the socioeconomic history of South India. She has participated in national and international conferences and has numerous publications such as Gender, Violence, and the Law in Indian Society, Searching for the Elusive Glass Ceiling in Higher Education, Distributive Justice, Poverty and Economic Development, Philosophizing Vis-a-vis Communalism and Human Rights Violations, Violence Against Women Within the Family, Feminism and International Law in India, and much more. And among her research experiences are projects from the State Commission of Women in Karnataka to prepare a training manual for the dowry prohibition officers, a study to identify the key issues in gender in the state of Karnataka, sponsored by the IFES, and domestic violence, a study through court records, and much, much more. Now, the event is going to be held as follows. We will have the first intervention by Dr. V.S. Elizabeth, who is going to have around 30 minutes for her to make her intervention and show us the presentation she has prepared for us. And then we'll have another 30 minutes or so for Lidia Casas to do her presentation. And then we'll have some minutes for questions from the public. So without further ado, Dr. V.S. Elizabeth, you have now your time.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to participate in this international webinar on Violence Without Borders. Very grateful to you for having facilitated this. And during a time like this, it is, I think this is one of the blessings that we are able to meet online and share, our experiences. And I think from that, we realize how much in common we have as a humanity, even though we may be, way beyond in different time zones even, but there's so much that we have in common. So thank you very much, and wish you all a very good evening. I will just speak on a few things right now that come from my experiences and my understanding of gender-based violence. As we see in other parts of the world, a thing that is common even in India. I, of course, am currently in Bangalore in South India, and across this country, which is quite a huge country with diverse cultures, religions, language groups, socioeconomic, statuses, is that gender-based violence is quite common. Gender-based violence occurs both in the private and in the public space. That is, in the homes, in offices, as well as when one is traveling in public transport or walking down the road, you see gender-based violence occurring. And gender-based violence is by those known to the victims or survivors of this violence, as well as by total strangers. It can be one's own parent, spouse, partner, friend, as well as, of course, completely total strangers who perpetrate such violence upon women, men, as well as, trans persons. It is always about forcing women, men, trans persons to conform to gender norms. So when you look at the reasons why this kind of violence happens, it is because they are seen as violating the gender roles, gender behavior that has been assigned to them by society. And in response to that violation, you have various forms of violence that are perpetrated in an attempt to teach them a lesson, and therefore to teach others, not to violate these norms of behavior and actions. The gender-based violence can be physical, sexual, psychological, emotional, even economic violence, depriving women, men, boys of sources of income or livelihood, of any access to resources so that they will conform to the gender norms. So, that is what I mean by saying economic violence. Now, when we look at the physical and sexual violence, in India, as in other parts of the world, you have sexual harassment, both on the street as well as in the workplace. You have sexual assault, both by known as well as by strangers. You have domestic violence, various forms of domestic violence. Now, of course, while these are things that are universal, the things that are kind of peculiar to the Indian context or maybe the South Asian context is that you have dowry-related violence. Failure to provide a certain amount of money and jewelry and other things at the time of marriage can result in young women being subjected to violence on a daily basis by their husbands and their in-laws within their homes. And a particular form of this violence in the Indian context is subjecting these young women to burns. Either the women, because they cannot bear the violence, commit suicide. Therefore, they pour kerosene or other such things that can burn and set themselves on fire, or they are set on fire by their husbands and in-laws. And most often, of course, they end up dying. So that is one form of domestic violence that you see in India. Another form of violence that you see, which is also gender-based, is murders that are committed by family members upon women and men who marry across caste and community. So, especially if the woman is of a higher caste and she marries a lower caste man, very often you find that the lower caste man will be killed. And if the woman does not conform and, they cannot control her, then she is also killed by their own family members. It is not, people generally in society who are doing this, but their own family members. Another form of violence against women that you see peculiar to South Asia is attacking young women who do not respond to the sexual advances made by men while they are walking to work or to college or, to their studies, by throwing acid on them, acid which disfigures their faces, disfigures their bodies, sometimes dying because of the third-degree burns, other times not dying, but having to live their entire life with intense pain, needing, plastic surgery, sometimes having to live with those disfigured faces despite it, and not often getting any kind of remedies. So these are some kinds of violence that you do see perpetrated upon women in the country. But there are also the trans persons, especially trans women, because these are men who, instead of, according to the society, according to the men who perpetrate such violence, these are men who, instead of being proud, instead of being happy being men, are humiliating men and, drawing contempt towards men by wanting to be like women, dressing like women, acting like women. And therefore, you find that these trans women are subjected to a great range of violence by family members who cannot accept that their sons do not want to remain sons but want to become daughters, by people in society who want to have sexual relations with them, in order to humiliate them, to perpetrate violence on them, from the police, because since they are trans women and they're unable to get jobs easily, very often the way in which they try to make a living is through begging or through sex work. And therefore you have them seen as violating the local laws, and therefore you have the police who subject them to sexual violence as well as physical violence. So this is something that trans women have to live on a daily basis with. Besides, of course, the fact that all trans persons, men or women, are not allowed to marry, are not allowed to cohabit with people that they love, and have difficulties finding jobs. And therefore, trying to make a living becomes a huge challenge for such people. So these are some of the things that you have in the context of gender-based violence, which occurs in India and in South Asia generally. Domestic violence is so widely prevalent that almost every other person that you talk to has been the victim or survivor of such violence, or is daily experiencing such violence in their lives. And in India, for a long time, we did not have laws to respond to sexual harassment, domestic violence, as well as these acid attacks. But in the 21st century, we do have, thanks to the proactive work of women's organizations and other human rights groups, we do have legislations today which specifically address these forms of violence. So we began with, of course, criminal laws with regard to both sexual harassment as well as domestic violence. So we have the Indian Penal Code, which is the product of colonial rule in South Asia. It was enacted in 1860. Amendments have been made to this legislation time and again, as recently as 2013. And this legislation kind of encompasses various forms of violence against women and trans persons by criminalizing dowry deaths. It criminalizes domestic violence. We have Section 498A, which addresses the question of cruelty within the family by one's spouse and in-laws. We have Section 375, which addresses the question of sexual assault, penetration of various kinds on different parts of the body by men on women's bodies. We have, as I said, Section 304B, which deals with dowry death. So if a young woman dies unnaturally within the first 7 years of her marriage, that and due to cruelty relating to dowry demands, that will be treated as dowry death. Amendments have been made to the Indian Evidence Act and the Criminal Procedure Code in order to facilitate the kind of evidence that would need to be procured in such cases of gender-based violence. Then in 2012, what we have is that we have 2013, we have a new legislation to deal with sexual harassment, both for the prevention as well as the prohibition of sexual harassment, as well as to deal with redressal mechanisms for addressing sexual harassment. Simultaneously, amendments were made to the criminal law to criminalize sexual harassment. So sections 354 A, B, C, D, and E, which have been included as a part of the amendment to the criminal law in 2013, which criminalizes looking at women, touching their bodies, stalking them. And we also have amendments made to the criminal law to include those who perpetrate acid attacks also as crime, as criminals. We also have civil laws which address the question of these kinds of violence against women. So we have the 2005 Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act. Interestingly, this particular legislation was drafted by women's groups, particularly this group called Lawyers Collective, who involved various kinds of groups and women's organizations in order to see what is a kind of civil remedy or what are the other kinds of remedies that women are seeking in the context of domestic violence. So for the first time, we actually had the recognition in the law of domestic violence as a particular form of violence which is violative of women's human rights. Till then, there was no such recognition of the violation of women's human rights in the context of domestic violence. This particular act, the main important features of this act is that it gives recognition, unambiguous recognition of the women's right to live free from violence. So it acknowledges that this is a very widely prevalent form of violation of women's human rights. And as a consequence, women are unable to access their other human rights. And therefore, unilaterally, unambiguously, it recognizes that women have a right to live free from violence. And it provides immediate relief to survivors of such violence in cases of emergency. This act also provides the right to reside in a shared household. It recognizes the fact that there is inequality within the home and that women have a right to live in their matrimonial homes. It ensures effective access to justice because it introduces new authorities and mechanisms like the protection officer, who would be the interface between the woman and the court. It also specifically addresses the right to protect women as well as children, both male and female. It covers mothers, daughters, sisters, widows, relations through adoption, because it is domestic violence is not only violence that is experienced within the marital home, it is also violence that daughters and mothers and sisters and widows experience. And therefore, this act is again important for that reason. Besides that, in India, marriage and marital relations are recognized and given more importance. And as a consequence, very often people who are in live-in relationships, and if there is violence in that context, are not given the same kind of protection. Whereas through this act, you have the recognition for relationships in the nature of marriage. So people in bigamous relationships, fraudulent marriages, in cohabitative relationships are also given protection against domestic violence. And this act takes both criminal and civil remedies for women. And there is a two-stage process. The first are civil orders which are passed by a magistrate who falls within the criminal justice system. And there is the question of protection orders, which are all civil orders, which are given. And if there is a breach by the perpetrator, there is a provision for arrest, imprisonment, or fine, which are, as you know, criminal remedies, for violation of the law. I mean, there is a lot more I could say about that particular act. If at all, anybody is interested, later on, you can ask me questions and I could address that. Now, in terms of the challenges that are facing India, one is, of course, in the context of the pandemic and people being restricted to their homes, not being able to go to their workplaces or to their places of education, is that there's a great deal of increase in domestic violence and sexual violence within the home. We've been constantly reading about reports of such violence because, since they're confined to the homes, access to the police or any kind of assistance has also become extremely problematic. This is one of the gigantic challenges that women and children are facing in the context of the pandemic, besides the pandemic itself. The other thing to keep in mind, in the context of India, is the issue of caste. The interaction, the intertwining of caste and patriarchy, which makes it, like domestic violence and sexual harassment are almost like part and parcel of every woman's experience in the Indian subcontinent. For me, I can remember every single incident of sexual harassment I was subjected to from the time I was a little girl going to school, traveling in the bus, the way the conductors used to behave, to when I'm walking back from school to my home, a boy who touched my body, to a man who made, suggestions of a sexual relationship, to the kind of, things that you hear from other students. And of course, as a woman, even, so sexual harassment isn't something which a woman is subjected to because of the kind of clothes she wears, or because she's beautiful, or because she's in the wrong time, wrong place. Because then the question is, what is the right time? Because I can tell you from my personal experience, I have experienced sexual harassment, in bright daylight, in the morning, in the afternoon, walking to school, walking to the shop, walking to procure, household groceries and vegetables, or trying to get some medicines, walking, on the road, walking back from studies. It could be, as early as 8:30 in the evening. I have never been outside the home on my own, walking around late in the night. So every time my experiences have been, when people are active, people are moving around. It's not like I was drunk or in a pub or a bar. Not that, those kinds of sexual harassment are justified. They are not. But, oftentimes when you talk about sexual harassment and domestic violence, the blame is placed upon women. That they were dressed inappropriately, that they were in places they ought not to have been, that they indulged in behavior that was unacceptable, to society, like they were drunk, or they were on drugs, or they were in relationships outside marriage, right? So when we see those kind of things that are there, then you realize that it is not about the women or the young girls. It is about the way in which men perceive how women should be and what women ought to do. And even in the context of, one of my former students who was gang raped, the medical officer who examined her, didn't find wounds on her body, and the young woman was not hysterical. And therefore, she went to the press to say that this person was not raped. I mean, what makes anybody make such comments if it isn't for the fact that there is an expectation of a certain kind of behavior from women? And when they do not do that, then the assumption is women are just sexually immoral and that they're sexually permissive. And therefore, these things happen to them, and that nobody realizes that no woman asks to be raped or subjected to sexual harassment. No woman invites sexual harassment or sexual assault. No woman invites domestic violence. In fact, in the context of domestic violence is you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Because, the kind of excuses people make is that, oh, she did not cook the food properly, oh, she did not take care of the children, oh, she talked back to me. I mean, reverse the genders. And would it be all right for a woman to beat her husband because, he was berating her? Would it be all right for her to beat her husband because he is not providing, money for the household? Would it be all right for the woman to beat her husband if he is having an affair, which oftentimes these men do? It is not, right? Women have been socialized into believing, especially in South Asia and in India in particular, that the husband is God. That he could be a drunkard, he could be, totally immoral man, but he is her God. She ought to tolerate him. She's got to put up with anything that he does because he's a husband. And through ideology, the idea is that she is, through religious, ideology, that her salvation lies in staying married. That if she were to die at the hands of her husband, she will be saved. And therefore, you have women who live in terribly abusive relationships without looking at, getting out of such violent experiences. And so this is, part and parcel of the kind of experiences that many women in India are subjected to. Another form of course, violence that is perpetrated in India is the abortion of female fetuses. Therefore, we have laws to address the prenatal diagnostic techniques that are used in order to diagnose the sex of the child. In India, it is illegal to inform the parents about the sex of the child, because as soon as you've informed the sex of the child, then the next thing that happens in the Indian context very often is that if it is a female, then that female fetus is aborted. And women have little or no control over their bodies. There are women who have been subjected to repeated abortions and who consequently suffer great damage to their health. But this is, again, very much a part and parcel of the violence that is perpetrated in India. As a consequence, the sex ratio has greatly fallen in many parts of India, especially in northwestern India. And even in many cities, where you have high level of literacy and educated women in employment, despite that, because of the skewed balance between men and women in terms of their status in society, is that abortion of female fetuses happens irrespective of the urban-rural divide, city and village kind of divide. And one of the grave consequences of this skewed sex ratio in the Indian context is that men from the northwestern part of India, in the states of Punjab, Haryana, etc., procure brides by paying to the parents of poor households for these women. And very often in some of these households in northwestern India, one woman is shared between, brothers, because they are unable to afford, having the unable to afford to pay for such brides for each brother. And therefore, you have one woman, because again, in the caste context is the idea that a woman has no caste. So you can get a woman from a lower caste, a woman who belongs to a poor family, because who else will, be willing to allow the purchase of their daughter. And these women then are given the status of the caste of the man that they are married to. And without their consent, they are subjected to having sexual relations with the other brothers in the family in order to continue the lineage of that family. And this is the status of women as a result of the abortion of female fetuses and the skewed sex ratio that is prevalent in the Indian context. So these are some forms of violence that we have in the Indian situation. And as a result, what you see is that there are numerous legislations to respond to many of these kinds of violations, but they have not been enough to stop such violence and to provide effective remedies to women in the context of pursuing it in the courts. And therefore, when you say, what are my ideas of solutions for such challenges and these forms of violence, it is education. Education, not only in the forms of formal education, in schools and colleges and universities, but education through media. As you know, today, there are so many online resources, and everybody's able to access them because everyone almost has a phone. And in this day and age, where there is internet connection accessible to everyone, is to use every form of media to perpetrate changes in attitude towards girls, boys, women, and men, to change ideas about gender roles, gender behavior, gender expectations, ideas about sex and gender. And from a feminist perspective, especially to see that the police officers, government officials, the judges, the lawyers, public prosecutors are all sensitized to these issues, to look at them through the eyes of women, boys, and trans persons who are subjected to such violence, so that everybody learns how violence impacts the lives of women, children, and trans persons, and as a consequence, the whole society. Violence against women, children, and trans persons isn't their problem. It is a problem of society. It's a problem of every man. And we need to see that students of law study law through feminist jurisprudence, because only then will we be able to understand how male biased the very concepts in law are. Because a lot of what law addresses in terms of crimes are crimes that take place outside the home in the public space. Whereas the crimes against women and children happen within the home. And therefore, when the law stops at the doorstep, it means you're not responding to the crimes that are perpetrated on the bodies of women and children. So we need to understand that. Our concepts of consent, our concepts of, objectivity and neutrality are not really objective and neutral. They are from a male perspective. Because, though we have the ideas of yes and no in all our languages, women's no is often taken as a yes. And the law does not really sufficiently address this question of consent, as having to be very clear, yes, from the woman who is being, propositioned for sex. We need to look at why women respond the way they do, or why they do not respond the way society expects them to respond. These are things which are only possible if we look at the law through feminist perspective. Otherwise, we just continue to reiterate the patriarchal norms and patriarchal roles. And, we can keep on legislating new laws, but it doesn't change anything for women on the ground. I mean, I am now 60 years old. I haven't seen any change in the way in which women are seen in society. So there may be formal equality for women through the law, through the constitution. There may be many laws that have been enacted to protect women's rights, but women's access in real terms is not there. And so long as there are cultural norms, social norms, which prevent women from accessing their rights, then there is no real equality in society. My idea of empowerment of women is when a woman is able to exercise control over her body and her life, that she has choice, real choice, and there isn't anything in society which prevents her from exercising that choice in her best interest by her, treating her as an adult and not as a ward, as somebody who doesn't have the capacity to make decisions for herself. It's only when we see that happen can we say we live in a society where women are empowered. And we cannot talk about equality of women and men till the conditions necessary for women to live a life of dignity have actually been made possible. And till that happens, it's only a fight for creating that kind of a situation where all human beings, and particularly women, are able to live with dignity and without even the fear of violence within their homes or outside. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor V.S. Elizabeth. We will now proceed to listen
Luis Eugenio.
to Lidia Casas Becerra.
Luis Eugenio, I'm sorry for interrupting.
No
Just wanted to let people know that the chat is open for you to write where you're visiting us from. We know there's a lot of people from all over the world. Thank you for joining us. And also you can start making your questions in the section of the Q&A on the bottom of your screens. So we can start collecting questions, and at the end we can ask our visitors to answer them. Thank you very much, Dr. V.S. Elizabeth, for your profound words. And Dr. Lydia is now open your mic for you to present to us your words. Thank you, Luis Eugenio.
Thank you.
En primer lugar, quiero agradecer. First of all, I want to thank my friend Fernando and Universidad Libre de Monterrey for inviting me to for this seminar and having and able to share my presentation with Elizabeth, who I haven't seen for many years. So it's a pleasure to listen to her, and not only listen to her, but also learn from her as a wise woman she is. I'm gonna speak about violence, gender violence in Chile. And a bit differently from Elizabeth, I'm going to try to give a context. Chile is not like Mexico, neither like India. It's a really small country. It's a long stretch of land with the desert in the north and the Patagonia in the south. We're more like 7+ million of inhabitants, and we're quite isolated, really. And we were more before the technologies, traveling by planes, because by the south, we only have the Antarctica, basically, the South Pole, and then the ocean and the mountains. So in this variety of geography that we have, women experience different types of violence, gender violence, and they're quite different in the kind of women who are subject of violence. Because of the migration coming into big numbers in Chile in the last 10 years, we can see the intersection between migration, the condition of nationality of those women coming from either Bolivia, Peru, or Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, coming to Chile, and also from Haiti in the northern part of the country. But also, they are also present in central Chile. But in the southern Chile, what we'll see is gender violence in context of racial discrimination on the basis of Aboriginal origin, ethnic origin. So one has to look at the data, one has to look at women's experiences that intertwine on the issue of gender, socioeconomic condition, nationality, and ethnic background, which is probably quite similar to what happens in Mexico, not only to women from rural and girls coming from rural areas, but also migrant women coming from Central America and trying to get across to the United States. So here are some data and also legal norms. We have a law on domestic violence. Actually, it's not on domestic violence. It's rather a law protecting from family violence, because it encompasses not only women being subject of violence by their partners, but also any members of the family. So it does not necessarily have a gender perspective, although most of the cases are the cases that are reported to the police or either to the prosecutor's office are by women. The issue here is that we have a law that enacted in 2005 that has two types of jurisdictions. One, any of the conducts that are considered to be criminal acts that will be prosecuted, investigated by the National Prosecutor's Office and tried under criminal jurisdiction. But any other offense that is considered to be a non-criminal act will be investigated and judged in family courts. These kinds of jurisdiction mixed together in one single law makes quite difficult at times for some of the operators of the justice system to decide, especially when they don't want to take the case. Many times, often, what happens is family court judges will try to get a victim, a woman, to say that she's battered for a long time, because she says that she's been battered by a long time. She will try and refer the case to criminal courts. So women may go in one court to another court system and not really having a particular rapid response, except by the fact that now they are obliged by law to decree a preventive measure, a protection measure. Usually the man being asked to leave the home or not to have any contact with the women or the children. In addition to that particular law that refers only to domestic violence, we also have the penal code that where is sanctioned femicide, that the law was enacted on femicides in 2010, and also on street harassment that came about in 2019. And of course, the criminal code has all the criminal sexual offenses. And the labor code deals with sexual harassment. Just to give you a context, just for the year 2020, we have 127,972 cases that were reported for domestic violence in the National Prosecutor's Office. At the same time, more than 26,000 cases of women on sexual-related crimes. Of those, more than 17,000 are related to minors, teenagers and girls and boys. And we had 58 femicides that were committed. And of those, 43 were femicides committed by the partners or former partners of the women. Femicide in Chile has been considered only on two different circumstances. When there is a special relationship between intimate femicide, when there is a special or a former partnership with a man, and or that they have, if there's no cohabitation, they have children in common. So it's not like in many other parts where any woman that has been killed would be called a femicide. In addition to that, just as Elizabeth was telling, we have some data over what happened has happened during the pandemic for at least 2020. The family courts were closed for in-person court hearings in mid-March 2020. And they began working on through digital telematic working. So the issue was that women would be able to access to justice in as much as they would be able to have the possibility to use the internet or know how to use the internet to make their reports into family courts and to file a suit. What obviously came up to be is the gap on the use of women for the internet, telephones, and the other. In a survey on women and technologies that got to be that was done in 2020, one out of 5 women has no access to internet. And those numbers really go up when you are dealing with women who live in rural areas, but certainly those women who are older and who do not know how to use really, or they do not have access to technology, or they don't know how to use the technology. What it was, just like it happened around the world, because gender violence is a global pandemic, and that usually is never treated at that. 97% rise was in the police contact, on telephone calls to the police on cases of domestic violence. And there was 149% rise into the emergency call to the Women's Center that are administered by the Ministry of Women's Affairs. We have, like in many countries, many governmental measures. One of them, it was called the silent reporting, is that women were able to get reporting to what was happening to them through a WhatsApp number, so that they didn't have even to call anybody. But they also have, the government set up hotlines established. But one of the problems that we could see is, if violence against women is a gender issue, the gender construction of how government also deals with this issue is also compromised, in the sense that what government did was basically contracted, hired telephone call centers into private agents to deal with the alerts, the calls, the phone calls that were making women, without really the skills, the capability to be able to refer women correctly, or to have the skills to deal with domestic violence. So although there is a good idea to have hotlines really prepare for times of quarantine, the thing is, government also shows the way that or much more neoliberal measures, instead of taking up the idea that you have to have a robust public service, they put it into private hands, and not with not having enough skills or capability to deal with the issue. Another measure that was also imported, I say it important because it was set up for the first time in Spain, is Alerta Mascarilla, is the 19 mask. So there were signs in all pharmacy, in chains of pharmacy. So if a woman would go to the counter and say that she wanted a mask, a 19 mask, it would mean that the person who was tending the pharmacy, the drugstore, would offer help to the women and to be able to deal with the situation, so that to provide help or either advise where to go. And this was important as a measure, I insist, taking from the example of Spain. But there was also another drawback. Pharmacies, drugstores, basically it was a campaign with the 3 major chains that controlled 93% of the drugstore market in Chile. But many of those are not neighborhoods. So women who live in poor neighborhood would not have access to this measure. On the good side, if the government realized that this is a drawback, we have Cajas Vecinas, which is a kind of banking center, neighborhood banking center of the National Bank, where people could have very limited finance dealings, like transfer money or take money as if it were a teller. And they are really much spread out the territory in rural areas as well. And those places, small businesses, neighborhood businesses, would have information for women to deal with where to go, what to do, and what phone numbers they could get in order to get help. So the pandemic, as Elizabeth said, has made a clear increase in violence, in gender violence, in sexual violence against women and girls. And just to show you more data, if I just want to show you some sexual related offenses by year. And you can see by number, the raw number, and by rate. And you see the numbers of all victims of sexual violence. But then you can also see the numbers and rate of victims who are minors under the age of 14. Why I'm making that particular precision on the age is the fact that any sexual intercourse with a girl would be deemed to be a rape, a statutory rape, whether or not the girl has actually consented or not for the sexual intercourse. So what we are seeing, in fact, is a slight increase every single year of sexual offenses. And for the year 2019, we only have partial data for the first 4 years. But what we've seen already is that the numbers of reports to the police or to the prosecutor have decreased. And the reason why the numbers have decreased with respect to girls especially is because they are constrained. They're constrained at home. There's no possibility where they could be taken care of in schools or in public health clinics where girls could actually be attended and possibly identify when they are subject to sexual or other forms of violence. And I want to just share with you in a bit of a different light what I see are the problems of the justice system. This is a research piece that we conducted in the year 2018, and it's already published. You can find it in our website at the Center of Human Rights. And it's called Due Diligence, where due diligence on one specific issue is violence against women and the decision of the public prosecutor not to follow, not to continue to prosecute, and to set aside any of the decision. This was an interesting research because for the first time, the public prosecutor decided to give us access to those files where they have decided not to continue with the prosecution, to find out what were the reasons why they would take on that route. This was, in terms of methodology, we had 422 files that were already selected, chosen by the public prosecution. We only took a look at those cases with battery. We did not look at threats. It's a whole bunch of cases, but only on battery. We would look at all the cases that were like set aside for not, they did not have enough evidence. It's 10 o'clock. Or they would not wanted to continue to prosecute. And we were looking at 212 to 16. And we also review and analyze 48 sentences on femicide that were that they were adopted, they were that they were done in 2017. And we also did interviews to 3 specialized prosecutors on domestic violence. What we did find among all the data is that the files got 422, 64.2% of those were by women were the victims. But we're not really interested in all women, but only women who were in intimate relationship. And 55.6% of those women were in that particular universe for our study. Most of the women who were in fact reporting, suing their partners, reporting their partners, were cohabiting. And only 22.1% were in fact married, or 2.5% were their former husband were in fact the perpetrators. And what is interesting is sorry, I missed some of the information. Here you have on the first, you have the range of years. On the second column, you have the age of the women, and on the third column you have the age of the men. Which is interesting is the track between 14 and 19 years old, is that you have 13 girls who are subject of domestic violence. And so this means really that these girls grew up in democracy, grew up in a condition where you already have a domestic violence law in place, and that the majority of the women who are in fact victims of violence, who have gone and reported their cases, are between the ages of 20 up to 37 years of old. But you can also see that women who are older women are also subject to violence from their husbands. And some of them need to be taken with more detail, because some of the cases are because their partners are senile, Alzheimer, quite aggressive, or either because they are just somebody who are using violence against your wife for many, or partner for many years. And one of the things that the police and the prosecutor has to look at is whether there's been a threat or use or threat to with a weapon, or who has in fact threatened women of killing. And as you can see, 21% use a weapon, and 8% only had the access to a weapon, and in 47% there was the threat of killing the women. One of the other things that usually people say is that men who are perpetrators of domestic violence have some kind of psychiatric, they're sick. They batter their wives because they are sick. What we could find in here is only 27% of the women declare to the police or to the prosecutor that their partners have some psychological or psychiatric condition. And so 2/3 of them have no condition whatsoever related to the use of violence. But the most important things here, as you can see, is that we are looking at whether the men, the partners, have used domestic violence when they have problematic use of alcohol or drugs. And 2/3 of them, in fact, batter when they are drunk. And so this is not to say that men who do not drink alcohol, who do not use drugs, would not use violence. But this is an important issue for public policy when it comes to rehabilitation and treatment for men who use drugs, and that is a major risk for women who engage in relationship with men who are in that very specific forms of behavior. We also wanted to see whether those men, in fact, did have previous criminal record. And 47% of the men did not have any criminal record. Only 14% have record related to domestic violence, and 17.4% had criminal records non-related to domestic violence. And 14% had criminal records, I mean, being convicted for any other criminal offenses. Which the last issues that I want to deal with is why women decide, why the prosecutor decides to close the file. 37% they say it's because the woman did not want to continue with the prosecution, or the woman was not cooperative with the prosecution, 13%. And the victim disappeared. Nobody knows where she is anymore. And that the victim changed version, 6.8%. And also when there is an agreement between the victim and the person who is and the aggressor. And this is important. Many times what you see is that women go back to the relationship for many other reasons. And so, and why? What is the motive behind? 16% of the women went back to the partners. Some of them, 7.9%, they don't want the man to go to jail. They don't want to hurt him. They go back because of their kids, or because they haven't had any conflict anymore with the perpetrator. Or others have said they don't have any time to give more time to the procedure, or has no more contact with the aggressor. And some of them also say that doesn't have more time. She's really fed up with the criminal procedure. So the thing is, the pass of time does have a whole impact on women. So when justice is late, you are basically not giving any justice. Women are, in fact, quite tired of the process. Women look for the other forms of protection. Women change cities, women change addresses, they move around. They don't even want to give their addresses, any information about their whereabouts to the prosecution, so that the men would not even know how to find her. The interesting thing is in a survey that in 2013 in Chile, they asked why women would not report to the police the last episodes of domestic violence. And 1/3 of the women said on psychological violence, they didn't do it because they considered it was not serious enough. But then they said because things got better, like the honeymoon, and 11%, almost 12% said that they thought that reporting to the police didn't really help at all. And on physical violence, 24% of the women said that they were scared. 14% said that things got better. And 12% felt that they were scared that they would not believe her because she didn't have any witnesses. And on sexual violence, 40% of the women said that they were ashamed to tell what had happened to her. But also 12% said that they didn't consider that to be serious or that things got better. The other forms of, I just wanted to be finishing, the other forms of violence, and I'm showing you conscientious objection. We in Chile have an abortion law that only permits abortion under 3 different circumstances of case of life is in risk of the women. Life risk when the fetus is malformed and in no possibility of any survival out of the woman's uterus, and in case of rape. And I find this to be very, it's gender violence. look at the map of Chile, and there is hospitals where 100% of obstetricians are objected to the ground to save the woman's life. But as we can see, when on the cases of fetuses malformed, the numbers of hospitals continue to grow in terms of accessibility to abortion services. And what is most discouraging is when it comes to the rape ground. The numbers of hospitals, the number of obstetrics, gynecologists that do not want to perform abortion in the case of rape is really an issue of gender violence, because they already women be victims of horrific crimes, and then late the state agents will victimize the women again for not providing her an speedy access to abortion. And I'm going to be here because I think I've taken too much time. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lidia. And before we go into questions, Luis Eugenio, I just want to thank both professors again for being with us tonight. We know for Dr. V.S. Elizabeth in Bangalore, it's really early over there. And for Dr. Lidia, it's super late. So we really appreciate you being with us right now. And so we can go now to questions. There are many questions and we have till 30. But we can start one by one to see how far along we go. And then if we cannot answer some of the questions, I'm sure that the professors can provide us with somehow we can write them, the questions, I hope. Luis Eugenio, I can start with a question, choosing one of the questions. So Pamela Toutli asked Dr. V.S. Elizabeth, I know, Doctor, you answered it, but if you could answer for everyone, how a Western feminist perspective can affect this problematic. Do you consider a decolonial feminism is necessary to attend the specific problems of your country?
Yeah, I mean, the point is that feminism, I don't think we can, just categorize, because we in the developing countries and other parts of the world have a tendency to dismiss arguments on human rights and feminism as being, Western in origin and therefore not relevant to our countries or our cultures. And I have always a big problem with that kind of an argument. While I do realize the limitations, they may be there in the fact that these theories of human rights and feminism originated in the West, I don't think we can dismiss the underlying arguments and analysis that these theories have brought to our understanding of violation of women's rights and the dangers that are there to women's existence. So it is important to not dismiss them as Western feminisms. For me personally, it has been extremely useful to refer to these feminist theories, particularly radical feminist theories, which have enabled us to understand that the acts of violence against women, the low status of women in our societies and cultures, is the product of patriarchy, that we live in male-dominated societies. I don't think that is particularly Western in origin. It is something which is prevalent in all of our societies. And therefore, the analysis that is provided by these feminist scholars has been extremely useful, even in terms of conceptualizing issues like domestic violence, sexual harassment. These very words were coined by these feminists. Therefore, we cannot just ignore that. At the same time, I do understand the point that the person who raised that question has asked, that there are certain culture-specific issues. Like in the context of India, there is the Dalit issue, the caste issue. And therefore, we need a little bit more understanding of the caste context, the caste interfaces, in order to be able to respond more clearly to the question of the interaction between caste and patriarchy, that it is not only about capitalism, it is not only about class, that it is also about caste, and also in terms of, the religious communities and the ways in which these can interact. So while, yes, there is a need for that kind of contextualization, both historically and culturally, I think it would be very wrong to just dismiss all feminisms that have originated in the West as not applicable to our context and say feminism should be, culture specific. And because so far as violence against women is concerned, it is universal. As you've heard, Professor Lydia speak, you've heard me speak, and if you read, you'll find there's so much of similarities in the kind of violence that is perpetrated on women, in the failure of the legal systems and society to respond to such violence, and which then says that, it is patriarchy, which is universal. And therefore, while we may take certain culture-specific issues, we have to use these feminisms, these theories, in order to fully respond to violence in our countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will proceed to the next question, which would be, as future policymakers, as lawyers, what can we do to prevent and address violence against women in a way that has perhaps not been addressed before? This question is for both of you, please, and thank you.
Lydia, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think that they're very, violence has a lot to do with the culture, and culture related to patriarchy and the asymmetric condition, the asymmetries between men and women. One of them is to be able to take away the idea that violence can be naturalized, normalized. And once our societies learn how to deal with that violence is not normal, and that the relationship between human beings has not to rest upon violence and gender violence. Women have been subject to be objects in many cultures. Women can be invisible for many people, just as girls. And the thing is, we educate, but from very early ages, to say that, one, violence is not permitted, violence is not justified, and violence cannot be condoned in many ways. At least in Latin America, we tend to justify on many different forms the violence that is subject to women. And so education plays a very significant role. We in law schools seldom learn about gender violence. We do not even know how to litigate cases on domestic violence. And that is a kind of side issue. So just as in primary school, in high school, or universities, we began talking about violence against women, gender violence, we are trying, I think, to go over that. And in Latin America, I completely agree with Elizabeth on the question of we cannot dismiss that radical feminism, but I think Latin American and also in other parts of the world, feminists have engaged with other forms or particularities that many of the white feminists did not see. That was class and race and ethnic origins. And the intersection between all those issues are very important and are kind of that we have to model societies where this, at least we're very clear there is question of gender, cultural injustices, as Nancy Fraser would say, and also the question of redistribution, social justice. So we have to take into account how our societies also imposes other forms of violence that we have to overcome. I don't know whether, Elizabeth, you want to comment?
Yeah, if I want to respond to the question, of what can you as future lawyers do, I would say that, lies in learning to look at these issues from the point of view of the survivors and victims. To look at law, any procedure, and see how it will affect women, how it will affect trans persons. Because, even as Lydia was talking about the kind of remedies that are available, the question that you need to see is, why have all these remedies not succeeded in providing relief for women and trans persons, right? for the simple reason that it isn't as if women and trans persons want to prosecute everyone who is subjecting them to violence, especially when the violence is by a person who is known to them, with whom they have an intimate relationship. What they want is the end of the violence. So you want to criminalize the act, not the person who is perpetrating the violence. So unless we recognize that and we provide remedies that women want, in order to end the violence in their lives, we're not going to be able to change that. So as future lawyers, as future judicial officers, and possibly even policymakers, if you can keep in mind that the law is not universal, that it is not objective, it is not neutral, and try to conceptualize what women undergo when these crimes are perpetrated upon them, and therefore provide remedies that will address these particular kinds of violence which are gender-based, you cannot really change the way in which this can be ended. And I think also is to not to more importantly, as in Lydia's presentation you heard, right? The women were saying they're not believed. Women who are subjected to sexual harassment, sexual violence are treated like they're liars. It is important that we change this perspective about women and trans persons. People who do not conform to our idea of how women and trans persons should be, or even how men should be, we need to change that perspective so that we start listening, and not imposing our point of view on them. Maybe there is a lot we can learn from listening to them and understanding what is it that they want. Why did they not scream out? Why did they not fight back? Unless we start doing that, we cannot really provide the remedies that, which will end the violence that we see around us.
Excellent, thank you. The next question is from Rebecca Leal, and it's for either Dr. Lydia or Dr. Elizabeth. Do you believe most of the responsibility to keep women safe is dependent on governments and its institutions, or do you believe the biggest cause of sexism comes straight from families and their ways of raising both men and women? Thank you.
I would say on the issue who is responsible, or I think the responsibility from international human rights law rests upon the state to make sure to guarantee the adoption of all kinds of measures to protect, to guarantee, and to protect from discrimination, from violence. So that's the first step, to make sure that it's not just simply society as a whole, because then it's nobody's responsibility. Secondly, obviously, there is a question of families and the question of other actors. Other actors are also responsible what happens in their workplaces. The enterprises our employers are responsible what happened in the enterprises. If workers are harassed, the employer is responsible, is liable for whatever is happening in there. And so it's not just a question of government. Civil society also plays a very important role in the fight against, the struggle against violence against women. And civil society, and mostly women collectives, women's organizations, feminist groups, are the ones who have, over the last 40 years, been fighting and putting forward the question of violence against women. And on the few years also, some of a decade or so, also about transgender, homophobia, lesbophobia. So it's a responsibility that rests upon all of us, but there are very clear-cut persons or institutions that do have to protect. One is the judiciary. One of them is the prosecutor's office. One is government in the prevention, health sector, and educational sector as well. So I just do not just want to say everybody, but because government has a very, very clear obligation to respond to the needs and the protection of rights of women and girls and transgender person as well. Elizabeth.
Governments don't come into existence from heaven. Right? Governments are the products of our society. The people who are there in the government, in the judiciary, in the police, they're all people who are members of our society. So unless the way in which we as individual members of a society look at women and trans persons and the gay, lesbian community, etc., the way in which people who are in these positions of authority will look at them will not be any different. So the way in which governments respond tell you the kind of societies we live in. They tell you that people in our society perceive women and trans persons and others in exactly the same way. But the difference between you and I and the way we think and the way people in positions of authority think is that they have power to implement and enforce. You and I can change the way we think and change the way in which people in our circle of influence think. But those people who are in positions of authority and power are the only ones who can implement these laws. So if they show that there is zero tolerance, for violence against, women, against trans persons, against, the gay, lesbian community, then it will make a huge difference in terms of, increasing reporting. Because then that, yes, if I go to report to the police station, the police officer will take me seriously, will not dismiss my complaint as nothing. So it is interconnected. You cannot say that the government has more responsibility or that we as members of society have more responsibility. The two are interconnected because members of the government come from us, but the members of the government have the power to change the policies, to change the laws, to implement them, to enforce them. And therefore, these two things have to go hand in hand. One cannot be given priority over the other. They have to simultaneously work if at all we are to see a change in our societies during our lifetimes.
Thank you very much, professors, for answering the questions. I think we're very close to hitting 30 minutes, and I don't think we can answer more questions. But we want to thank you for being with us tonight again, even though it's very early in Bangalore and very late in Santiago. Luis Eugenio, do you want to finish the session?
Yes, Felix, thank you. There are not enough words to thank you for making this event possible, taking into account the difficulties that may arise due to us being in different countries and on different continents also. There is no doubt that we have been very privileged for having the opportunity to learn a little bit about your experiences, about your perspectives and teachings. So on behalf of the International Law Society and the Facultad Libre de Derecho de Monterrey, we are deeply grateful for your presence today, and please know that the doors of the faculty are and will always be open to you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be part of this webinar.
Thank you as well to all of our attendees that are here with us tonight as well.